I am Joshua, 29, and my parents ignored my college graduation to throw a party for my golden child brother. Before I tell you about how they begged for my forgiveness when I exposed their massive financial lie in front of our entire family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I was sitting on the cold, dark leather sofa in the center of my brand new living room when the vibration of my phone shattered the absolute quiet of the morning. The phone was resting on a heavy glass coffee table, and the buzzing sound seemed to echo against the freshly painted walls. I leaned forward, the morning sunlight catching the dust motes dancing in the air, and looked at the glowing screen. The notification displayed a name I had not seen light up my phone with a text message in a very, very long time. It was my mother, Martha. The message was short, sickeningly sweet, and entirely manufactured. It read, "Darling, we need to talk. We are waiting for you. Come home this weekend, darling." I just stared at that one specific word, darling. She had not called me darling since I was 12 years old, back before my older brother Wyatt became the undeniable center of her universe. I leaned back into the sofa and looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new home. I had just closed on a $990,000 penthouse in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a milestone I had fought tooth and nail to reach. Just 3 hours earlier, I had stood on the balcony with a mug of black coffee, looked out over the sprawling city skyline, and snapped a single photograph. I didn't post a long, bragging caption. I didn't tag the location or list the purchase price. I just uploaded the picture to my Instagram account with one simple word: home. I rarely used social media. I kept my life private, mostly because the people who shared my last name had never shown any genuine interest in it anyway. But that morning, the sunlight hitting the glass buildings felt like a hard-won victory that I simply needed to document for myself. However, people in my family talk. News travels like a wildfire in dry brush when it involves perceived wealth. And clearly, the wildfire had reached my mother's phone. My partner, David, walked into the living room. David is a certified public accountant. He is a man who reads bank statements, tax returns, and audit reports the way other people read gripping thriller novels. He is incredibly steady, fiercely logical, and he absolutely does not let emotional manipulation cloud the hard numbers. He was carrying 2 fresh mugs of coffee. He walked over, handed me a mug, sat down next to me on the sofa, and his eyes immediately drifted to the glowing screen of my phone. He read the text message. He didn't gasp. He didn't act shocked. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark roast coffee, lowered the mug, and raised one single eyebrow. I picked up the phone and set it face down on the glass table. The silence in the penthouse was thick, heavy with the weight of the past 7 years. I knew exactly what that text message meant. It was not a mother suddenly realizing she missed her youngest son. It was not a sudden burst of maternal guilt. It was a predator realizing that the prey she had been quietly draining for years had suddenly proven to be much more valuable than she initially calculated. I had spent the last 7 years of my life building a career from absolute nothing. I had survived on cheap frozen vegetables, generic brand rice, and tap water. I had worked my way up the corporate ladder, putting in 60-hour weeks, taking the shifts nobody else wanted, and volunteering for the hardest projects. I earned every single dollar of my salary. Nobody handed me a trust fund. Nobody paid for my college tuition. And certainly, nobody in my family had ever celebrated a single one of my successes. I looked over at David. He knew the entire story. He knew about every late-night panic attack, every incredibly tight budget, and most importantly, he knew about the thick manila envelope sitting on our pristine granite kitchen counter right at this very moment. We had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously putting that envelope together. It contained printed public records, highlighted bank transfer histories, and a heavily documented timeline that proved a betrayal so deep, so fundamentally cruel, that it still made my chest ache physically when I thought about it. "So," David said, his voice calm, anchoring me firmly to the present moment, "what do you want to do about the sudden invitation?" "I am going to reply," I said, my voice sounding much steadier than I felt. I am going to tell her that I will be there on Saturday evening. David nodded slowly. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He didn't tell me to just block her number and move on. He knew me too well for that. He knew this was not going to be a tearful family reunion. This was going to be an execution of the truth. They had clearly set a stage for me, expecting the quiet, compliant, ATM machine version of Joshua to walk through their front door, be dazzled by their fake affection, and open his wallet to fund whatever new crisis Wyatt had created. They had absolutely no idea that I was bringing my own script to their little play. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I didn't use exclamation points. I didn't say I missed them. I simply typed, "I will be there Saturday at 6 p.m. I hit send, locked the screen, and slid the phone into my pocket. The drive to my hometown of Cooperton, Georgia, takes about 4.5 hours from Raleigh. As David and I drove down the interstate that Saturday morning, the landscape outside the car windows slowly shifted from modern, glittering glass buildings and heavy traffic to dense, dark pine trees, winding two-lane rural roads, and dilapidated gas stations. The manila envelope was resting on the back seat, heavy with facts, numbers, and irrefutable proof. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white with tension. David kept his hand resting gently on my knee, offering a silent stream of support. We didn't listen to music. The quiet hum of the car tires on the asphalt was the only sound. To truly understand the crushing weight of that manila envelope resting in the back seat, and to understand exactly why I was willing to willingly walk back into a house full of people who had spent years treating me like an invisible ghost, you have to go back. You have to go back exactly 7 years, to the day my existence was officially and permanently erased from my own family's narrative. You have to go back to the day I learned that love in my family was highly conditional, and the conditions were completely rigged against me from the start. 7 years ago, I was 22 years old, chronically sleep-deprived, and running on nothing but cheap diner coffee and pure, stubborn willpower. My graduation day at North Carolina State University was supposed to be the ultimate payoff for 4 brutal, soul-crushing years of survival. You see, my older brother, Wyatt, got the entire family college fund. He was the golden child, the high school football star, the charismatic older brother who could charm his way out of a speeding ticket and do absolutely no wrong in my mother's eyes. My parents happily paid for his out-of-state tuition, his off-campus apartment, his meal plans, and even bought him a brand new car as a going-away-to-college present. When it was my turn to go to college 2 years later, I sat at the kitchen table with my acceptance letter, beaming with pride. My mother looked at the letter, sighed heavily, and told me that the money was simply gone. Wyatt's expenses had been more than they anticipated. So I had a choice. Abandon my dream of a degree or fund it myself. I chose the latter. I worked the graveyard shift at a dingy Shell gas station out on Route 9. I mopped sticky floors at 3 a.m., sold lottery tickets and stale cigarettes to exhausted truck drivers, and studied complex economics textbooks under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights behind the bulletproof glass of the cash register. I would finish my shift at 7 a.m., sleep for 3 hours in my rusted Honda Civic, and walk into my morning lectures smelling faintly of gasoline and cheap coffee. I did this for 4 years. I didn't go to parties. I didn't take spring break trips. I kept my head down, and I maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA. I earned my degree summa cum laude. The university arena held over 4,000 people on the morning of commencement. The air inside the massive building was thick with excitement, loud with the blare of smuggled air horns, cheering families, and parents screaming the names of their children as they crossed the stage. I wore my dark blue graduation gown, the fabric scratchy against my neck, and the heavy gold honor cords draped proudly over my shoulders. I sat in a hard plastic folding chair on the floor of the arena, holding the commencement program so tightly my fingers cramped. I had mailed my parents a formal, cream-colored invitation 2 months in advance. Inside the card, I had written in my best handwriting, "Row 7, seats 4 and 5 are saved for you. I can't wait to see you." I had reminded my mother 3 separate times over the phone. The night before the ceremony, she had smiled at me through the blurry screen of a video call and promised, We wouldn't miss it for the world, Joshua. We will be there. When my name was finally called over the booming loudspeakers, the crowd erupted for me just like they did for everyone else. I walked across the stage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dean of the college shook my hand firmly. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Outstanding work, Mr. Myers. You earned this." I smiled, a massive, genuine smile. I turned toward the audience, clutching my diploma cover, and eagerly scanned the crowd for row 7. I looked for my mother's bright red coat. I looked for my father's familiar face. Row 7, seats 4 and 5 were completely empty. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I stumbled off the stage, the cheers around me suddenly sounding like they were underwater. After the ceremony concluded, the campus lawn turned into a chaotic sea of hugs, tears, and flashes from expensive cameras. Fathers were lifting their sons off the ground. Mothers were crying and fixing their daughters' hair for pictures. Grandparents were handing out bouquets of flowers. I stood completely alone near the exit doors of the arena, holding my diploma in both hands like a waiter holding a serving tray. My phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping to see a text saying they were stuck in traffic or they were lost on campus. It was a single text message from my mother, Martha. "Sorry, honey. Wyatt needed us more. You understand, right?" I read the message 3 times. I didn't cry. Crying would mean that I was surprised by her actions, and the heartbreaking truth was, I wasn't surprised at all. That afternoon, I walked alone to the remote student parking lot. The lot was emptying out as families drove off to celebratory lunches. I unlocked my beat-up Honda Civic, opened the trunk, and placed my summa cum laude diploma right next to a plastic basket full of dirty laundry. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes in total silence before turning the key. A week later, my lease ended, and I drove the 4 hours back to Cooperton to pack up the last of my childhood belongings before officially moving to Raleigh. When I walked through the front door of the yellow ranch house I grew up in, the living room was still completely covered in silver and gold balloons. There was a massive, half-eaten sheet cake sitting on the kitchen counter. Written in thick, blue icing across the remaining vanilla cake were the words, "Wyatt and Jessica forever." The confetti from my brother's surprise engagement party was still mashed deep into the fibers of the living room carpet. My graduation had been a week ago. The confetti from his party was still on the floor. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, casually folding napkins and flipping through a lifestyle magazine. She didn't even look up when I dragged my heavy duffel bag through the front door. "Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Why didn't you come to Raleigh?" She sighed, closing the magazine with a slow, deliberate movement that told me I was annoying her. "Joshua, please do not make this all about you again. Wyatt's engagement is a massive, once-in-a-lifetime milestone. You will have other achievements, honey. Wyatt needed the spotlight that day. You are smart, you can handle yourself. He needed us." I looked past her to the family refrigerator. It was a visual, undeniable map of her priorities. There were exactly 11 photographs held up by magnets on that door. All 11 were of Wyatt. Wyatt in his football uniform, Wyatt at a college tailgate, Wyatt holding a beer with his frat brothers. The honor roll certificate I had proudly taped there a month prior was gone. I found it later that night, crumpled up under an empty cereal box in the recycling bin. My father, Charles, was sitting on the living room sofa, watching a sports broadcast on mute. He was a good, hard-working mechanic, a man with permanent grease stains on his hands and a notoriously quiet mouth. I knew he loved me, deep down in some inaccessible part of his heart, but he loved avoiding conflict with my mother much, much more. In our house, peace meant agreeing with Martha. He didn't say a single word to me. He didn't even make eye contact. He just stared blankly at the television screen. I packed my bags that night, loaded my car in the dark, and moved to Raleigh. I started my entry-level data analyst job. I lived in a tiny studio apartment the size of a walk-in closet. I ate rice and frozen broccoli 5 nights a week to save money. I told myself I was finally free from their shadow. But the past has a terrifying way of finding you, especially when it decides it needs access to your wallet. Life in Raleigh was grueling, but it was mine. I had full control over my space, my time, and my meager finances. I was 23 years old when my phone rang late on a rainy Tuesday night. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer it, but the late hour made me worry about an emergency. Joshua. Her voice came through the speaker, thin, strained, and dripping with perfectly manufactured panic. The mortgage payment on the house just went up. Your father's back is completely giving out. He can barely stand at the auto shop for a full shift anymore. The medical bills are piling up. Joshua. We might lose the house. I sat on the edge of my cheap, lumpy mattress and stared blankly at the water stain on my apartment ceiling. I pictured my father limping around the cold concrete floor of his garage. I pictured the yellow house on Pannon Lane, the front porch where I learned to ride a bike. How much do you need? I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Just $1,200 a month, she said quickly, as if she had rehearsed the exact number. Just until we get back on our feet. I swear, Joshua, it's just to keep a roof over your father's head. $1,200 was nearly half of my entire take-home salary at the time. I did the math in my head instantly. I knew it would mean skipping meals. I knew it would mean walking 3 miles to work in the snow instead of buying a subway pass. I knew it meant no savings, no emergency fund, no life outside of working and sleeping. But it was my father's home. I couldn't let them be evicted. I agreed. I set up an automatic bank transfer the very next day. On the 15th of every single month, like absolute clockwork, $1,200 vanished from my checking account and landed directly in hers. Years passed. I worked relentlessly. I finally got a major promotion at work, bumping up my salary significantly. My life became slightly more comfortable, but I never stopped the automatic transfers. 6 years. 72 months of sending $1,200. I never once asked to see the bank statements. I never asked to see the mortgage bills. I trusted that my mother was paying the bank. That blind trust was my most fatal mistake. 3 years ago, the phone rang again. Same Tuesday night timing. Same desperate, edge-of-tears tone. Joshua, the car completely died, she sobbed. Your father cannot walk to the bus stop in the winter with his bad back. He needs a reliable vehicle to get to the shop. I found a great deal on a used Chevy Equinox for $22,000, but my credit score is too low to qualify for the loan. The bank won't approve me. I need you to co-sign the loan. Please, Joshua. I held the phone away from my ear and stared at it. Mom, a $22,000 loan is a massive commitment. If I co-sign, my name is legally on the line. If you miss a payment, it ruins my credit. Her voice hardened instantly, the tears vanishing like magic. I will handle every single payment, Joshua. Don't you trust your own mother? After everything we did to raise you, we put clothes on your back for 18 years. I thought of my dad, shivering at a bus stop. I signed the digital loan paperwork the next morning. For the first 2 years, she actually paid on time. I almost forgot the loan existed. Then, 6 months ago, I received a certified letter from the bank in my mailbox. The car payment was 14 days late. I immediately texted her in a panic. She brushed it off effortlessly. Just a minor hiccup with the bank transfer, honey. Don't be so dramatic. I'm handling it. 2 months later, another formal notice arrived. 19 days late. These late payments acted like a wrecking ball to my credit score. It dropped 11 points in just 3 months. I had just gone under contract to purchase my penthouse, the biggest financial achievement of my life, and the sudden drop in my credit triggered a severe risk review from my mortgage lender. I was suddenly facing the terrifying reality of losing the home I had worked 7 years to buy. The life I had painstakingly built with my own 2 hands was actively being threatened because my mother could not be bothered to pay a car bill on time. I called her to confront her about the late payments, begging her to understand the jeopardy she was putting me in. Instead of apologizing, she immediately pivoted to a massive guilt trip. She completely ignored the car loan and demanded even more money, claiming Wyatt was going through a rough patch and needed help with his bills. When I bluntly refused to send Wyatt a dime, she turned ice cold and hung up on me. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was my Uncle Robert, my father's older brother. He is a strict, no-nonsense man who works in construction. We rarely spoke, so his call immediately put me on edge. "Joshua," he said gruffly, skipping any polite greetings, "we need to talk." "What is it, Uncle Robert? Is Dad okay?" "Your mother has been running her mouth," he said, his voice tight with anger. "We were at Aunt Sarah's funeral last week. Your mother stood in the reception hall and told the entire extended family that you moved to the big city, became an arrogant snob, and completely cut us all off. She told everyone that you refused to send a single dime to help when your father was in the hospital last October with severe kidney stones. She said she called you begging for help with his medical bills, and you hung up on her." I froze in my kitchen, my blood running cold. "Uncle Robert, Dad was in the hospital? I never got a call. I didn't even know he was sick. She never told me." Uncle Robert exhaled sharply into the phone. "That's exactly what I figured, son. I knew her story smelled like garbage. There is something deeply wrong going on in that house, Joshua. She is spinning a web. Watch your back." I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter until my fingers hurt. My mother was not just quietly draining my bank account. She was actively destroying my reputation. She was painting me as a cruel, selfish villain to the entire family, so she could flawlessly play the role of the suffering, victimized mother. The storm wasn't just approaching anymore. I was standing right in the dead center of it, and the wind was howling. That night, David came home from his accounting firm and found me sitting motionless at the kitchen island, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my laptop. I was completely numb. I told him everything Uncle Robert had said. I told him about the devastating lies at the funeral. I told him about the $1,200 monthly transfers that I had been sending for 6 straight years. I told him about the precarious car loan and the late notices threatening our penthouse. David is not a man who offers empty sympathy or useless platitudes. He is a man of decisive action. He didn't offer me a tissue. He opened his own laptop, cracked his knuckles, and went straight to work. You know, property tax records, deed transfers, and lien histories are entirely public information in the state of Georgia, right? David said, his eyes scanning multiple open tabs on his browser with the speed of a predator. "I never even thought to look," I admitted, feeling a deep, suffocating wave of shame wash over me. I was a professional data analyst. I looked at numbers, trends, and discrepancies for a living. Yet, I had blindly, foolishly trusted my mother's tears for 6 years without ever verifying a single fact. David aggressively typed in my parents' Cooperton address. He pulled up the county clerk's public database. He navigated to the mortgage and lien history. The screen loaded. David suddenly stopped typing. The silence in the room was deafening. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Then he slowly turned the laptop to face me. "Joshua, look at this. Read it out loud." I leaned in and read the text on the screen. The status of the primary mortgage on the yellow ranch house on Pannon Lane said, in bold, undeniable capital letters, "Satisfied." Below that, the payoff date read, March 2019. I scanned the rest of the page. No secondary liens. No home equity lines of credit. No outstanding tax debt. The house was completely 100% paid off. March 2019. I started sending her $1,200 a month in October 2019. The house had been completely paid off for 7 full months before she ever made that initial tearful phone call claiming my father was going to be thrown out on the street because of his bad back. I did the math in my head instantly, my brain working on autopilot while my heart shattered. 72 months, multiplied by $1,200. $86,400. I had sent $86,400 of my hard-earned salary to a ghost mortgage, to a black hole. Where did the money go? It didn't take a financial genius to figure it out. It went to Wyatt. It went to fund his lifestyle, his cars, his vacations, his endless string of bad decisions. My mother had literally stolen my future, stolen the money I should have been saving for my own life, to comfortably fund my brother's present. And she did it all while standing at funerals telling the family I was a selfish, ungrateful monster. Cold, absolute calm washed over me. It was a terrifying sensation. The anger I felt was so intensely hot that it completely bypassed the urge to scream or throw things. It settled deep into my bones as a sharp surgical focus. I didn't want to call her and yell over the phone. A phone call was far too easy. She could just hang up. She could cry, twist my words, and play the victim again. No, I needed an audience. I needed her to face the absolute, undeniable truth in front of the exact same people she had lied to for years. That weekend, I walked out onto the balcony of my penthouse. I took the photo of the Raleigh skyline. I made sure the lighting was perfect. I made sure the expensive, modern aesthetic of the building was clearly visible. I posted it on Instagram, knowing full well that she obsessively stalked my page from a fake account, even though she had publicly unfollowed me on Facebook to maintain her narrative of my abandonment. It was a trap, and it worked faster than I could have ever anticipated. 3 hours later, the notification pinged. The text arrived. "Darling, we need to talk." David helped me prepare the execution. I logged into my bank portal and printed out my statements going back 6 entire years. I used a bright yellow marker to highlight every single $1,200 transfer. Next to that thick stack of papers, I placed the official county property deed record showing the house was paid off in March 2019. I printed the official late payment notices from the Chevy Equinox car loan. I put every single document inside a thick, heavy manila envelope. I didn't stop there. I called my bank and initiated a unilateral refinance of the car loan. Because my income was now very high and my credit was recovering, I was able to take over the loan entirely and remove her name completely from the title. She would still possess the physical car, but she no longer had any legal leverage over my credit score. If she missed one more payment, I had the legal authority to send a tow truck to her driveway and repossess the vehicle immediately. The leash she had on me was officially severed. We packed our overnight bags. We got into the car. As David merged onto the highway heading south toward Cooperton, he reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "You ready for this?" he asked softly. I patted the thick manila envelope resting on the center console between us. "I have been ready for this for 7 years," I said. We pulled onto my parents' street just as the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows over the lawns. The road was absolutely lined with cars. I recognized Uncle Robert's heavy-duty work truck. I saw my cousin Nathan's blue sedan. I saw vehicles belonging to Aunt Mary, Uncle John, and even Mr. and Mrs. Samuel, the notoriously gossipy elders from my parents' local church. My mother had not just invited the immediate family for a quiet dinner. She had invited an audience. She had assembled a jury. She wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone to watch the wealthy, prodigal son finally open his massive checkbook for the struggling golden child. She wanted to lock me in a room full of heavy social and religious pressure so I would be too embarrassed to say no. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, grabbed the manila envelope, and walked up the concrete driveway. The storm was here. The front door swung open before my foot even hit the top step of the porch. My mother rushed out, wearing a floral Sunday dress, her hair perfectly styled, and a wide, aggressively theatrical smile plastered across her face. "My boy is home," she announced loudly, throwing her arms around my neck in a suffocating embrace. She smelled like heavy, expensive perfume and underlying desperation. Behind her, standing in the hallway, several people actually clapped. It was a nauseating performance. I walked past her into the living room. They had pushed the dining table and a folding table together to make a massive, banquet-style seating area right in the middle of the room. There were 20 people staring at me. Above the fireplace, someone had actually hung a cheap paper banner that read, in glittering gold letters, "Family First." My father, Charles, was standing in the far corner near the kitchen doorway, intensely focused on drying a perfectly clean water glass with a towel. He wouldn't look at me. Wyatt and his wife, Jessica, were sitting at the absolute head of the table like royalty holding court. Wyatt gave me a tight, arrogant nod, his arms crossed over his chest. Jessica offered a weak, nervous smile. David and I took the only two empty seats left at the far end of the table. Dinner was a loud, chaotic, overwhelming affair. Aunts passed heavy dishes of casserole and cornbread. People shouted superficial questions down the table at me about living in a high-rise building and city traffic. I answered politely, keeping my tone neutral, but I barely touched the food on my plate. I kept my right hand resting firmly on my leather bag, feeling the stiff outline of the manila envelope hidden inside. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and coffee was being poured, the room naturally quieted down. The tension shifted. My mother stood up from her chair. She literally tapped her silver spoon against her crystal water glass. Clink, clink, clink. The classic, cliché attention grab. Every face turned toward her. "Family," she began, her voice projecting across the room with practiced ease. "I want to say how incredibly blessed we are tonight. As most of you know, our Joshua has done very well for himself in Raleigh. He has built a wonderful career, and he just recently bought a beautiful, expensive new penthouse. We always knew he was smart. He gets his drive from me." A few aunts murmured their warm approval. Uncle John raised his coffee mug to me from across the table. David's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed once. My mother pivoted smoothly. Her smile grew tighter, her eyes locking onto mine with the intensity of a hawk. And because the Myers family always looks out for each other, and because family is first, Joshua has generously offered to step up and help his brother. Wyatt has had a very tough year. He lost his job, the economy is terrible, and things are tight for him and Jessica. But Joshua is going to make sure Wyatt doesn't lose his home. He's going to help them get back on their feet. Isn't that right, Joshua? The entire room turned to look at me simultaneously. 20 pairs of eyes, heavy with expectation, social pressure, and judgment. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, looking incredibly smug, waiting for his payout. Jessica dabbed at her dry eyes with a paper napkin, playing the role of the humble, grateful sister-in-law to perfection. My mother looked down at me with a triumphant, airtight glare. She had cornered me. In her manipulative mind, there was absolutely no way I would embarrass myself or humiliate the family by saying no in front of the church elders and the extended relatives. I stood up slowly. The wooden legs of my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the silence. The room was dead silent. I unzipped my leather bag, reached inside, pulled out the thick manila envelope, and placed it flat on the table in front of me. "I did not offer to pay for Wyatt's lifestyle," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any shouting, but it carried perfectly to the back of the room. "I never said that. Not in a text message, not on a phone call, not in any universe. That is a complete lie." My mother's triumphant smile faltered instantly. A flash of genuine panic crossed her eyes. "Joshua, please. Now is not the time to be selfish. We are family. Family helps family." "Selfish." I repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the air. I opened the metal clasp of the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of papers. "For the last 6 years, I have transferred $1,200 every single month directly into your checking account, Mom. Every single month, without fail. You told me it was to pay the mortgage so Dad wouldn't lose this house." I looked over at my father. He shrank back against the kitchen doorframe, closing his eyes tightly. I turned back to the room and handed the first, brightly highlighted document to Uncle Robert, who was sitting to my immediate left. According to the public county records for Cooperton, Georgia, which anyone in this room can look up online, the mortgage on this house has been paid in full since March 2019. Uncle Robert aggressively snatched the paper. He shoved his reading glasses onto his face. He stared at the official county seal, his eyes scanning the text. His face turned a deep, violent shade of red. "I have sent $86,400 to a ghost mortgage," I said, my voice rising slightly, commanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. "I don't know exactly what Wyatt spent my money on, but I know, and now all of you know, that it did not go to saving this house. Furthermore, the car loan I co-signed for you because you claimed Dad needed a vehicle? I just refinanced it solely into my name. Your name is off the title. If you miss one more payment, I am sending a tow truck to repossess it. You don't hold my credit hostage anymore." The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass of sweet tea. Aunt Mary covered her mouth with both of her trembling hands. Mr. Samuel looked at his wife in pure, unadulterated shock. My mother's face drained of all color. She looked like the floor had vanished beneath her. "Joshua, you are airing dirty laundry. This is a private family matter. How dare you disrespect me in front of our guests?" "You invited the audience, Mom," I replied coldly, looking her dead in the eye. "You wanted everyone here to watch me say yes to your extortion. So now they get to watch me say no. And they get to see exactly who you are. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The shockwave that hit the dining room was violent, sweeping away decades of carefully maintained secrets. The meticulously constructed illusion of the perfect, loving Christian Southern family shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the dining room floor. Uncle Robert stood up, slamming both of his heavy, calloused hands flat on the table. The silverware rattled violently against the porcelain plates. He looked directly at my mother, his eyes burning with a fury I had never seen before. "Martha, is this true? Look me in the eye. Did you steal from this boy?" My mother opened her mouth, her jaw working up and down, but no words came out. She looked frantically at Wyatt, silently pleading for her golden child to jump in and provide backup. But Wyatt was completely frozen, staring blankly at the timeline sheet I had dropped on the table, his face pale and sweating. "You told me Joshua abandoned this family," Uncle Robert roared, his voice echoing off the walls. "You stood at Sarah's funeral and told Mary he hung up the phone when Charles was in the hospital. You made us all think he was a heartless monster, all while you were quietly draining his salary to pay for Wyatt's messes. I was protecting this family," my mother finally screamed, tears of genuine panic and lost control streaming down her face. It was the first honest emotion I had seen from her all night. "Wyatt needed the help. Joshua makes plenty of money in the city. He has no kids. It isn't fair that Wyatt struggles while Joshua buys penthouses." Then, the most shocking movement of the night occurred. My father, Charles, moved. He pushed himself away from the kitchen wall. He walked slowly toward the center of the table. He looked 10 years older, broken, and deeply, fundamentally ashamed. He looked past my mother, ignoring her completely, and locked eyes with me. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I am so sorry, Joshua," my father whispered. His voice was gravelly, weak, and filled with a lifetime of regret. "I am so sorry." "Sorry for what, Charles?" Uncle Robert snapped, not letting up the pressure. "For letting your wife rob him blind? For graduation," my father said softly, a single tear escaping and rolling down his cheek. The room went deathly quiet again. The anger in my chest paused, replaced by deep confusion. I frowned. "What do you mean, Dad?" My father looked down at the hardwood floor, unable to hold my gaze any longer. Uncle Robert let out a heavy, incredibly sad sigh and took over the explanation. "I was going to wait to tell you this privately, Joshua, but since everything is out in the open, you deserve the whole truth. 7 years ago, on the morning of your college graduation, your father's car wouldn't start. He walked 2 miles to my house at 6 a.m. and borrowed my truck. Uncle Robert paused, glaring at Martha. He drove 4 hours to Raleigh. He got there early. He sat in the very back row of that arena. He watched you walk across that stage and get your diploma, Joshua. He was so proud. My breath hitched violently in my throat. I stared at my father, the room spinning slightly. You were there? You saw me? He was... Uncle Robert continued, his voice thick with disgust, until Martha called him in a frantic panic. She told him Wyatt had collapsed at the engagement party. She told him his heart was giving out and to drive back immediately because they were calling an ambulance. So Charles panicked and left. He drove straight back. And when he got here, Wyatt was perfectly fine, drinking a beer in the backyard. It was a vicious lie to get Charles out of your audience so you would be completely alone. A physical, agonizing pain shot through my chest, sharper than any anger. My father had been there. He had seen my greatest achievement, and my mother had ripped him away out of pure, unadulterated spite, just to ensure her narrative of my isolation was complete. Before I could even process the magnitude of that betrayal, my cousin Nathan stood up from his chair. Nathan is a quiet guy. He works as a clerk at the county courthouse, filing legal documents and managing records. He rarely speaks at family gatherings, preferring to observe. Since we are throwing all the cards on the table tonight, Nathan said, his voice remarkably steady and loud enough for the whole room to hear. Aunt Martha, do you want to tell Jessica why Wyatt really lost his job 3 months ago? Jessica, Wyatt's wife, snapped her head toward Nathan, her eyes wide with confusion. What are you talking about, Nathan? The company downsized his department. He was laid off. Nathan shook his head slowly. No, Jessica. 3 months ago, Wyatt was pulled over on Route 9 at 2 in the morning. He blew twice the legal limit. He was arrested for a DUI. He lost his job because his commercial driver's license was immediately suspended, and he couldn't legally drive the company vehicles anymore. I know this because I processed the paperwork at the courthouse myself. Aunt Martha came in at 2 a.m. and paid his massive cash bail. Jessica gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. She turned to Wyatt, grabbing his arm aggressively. Wyatt? A DUI? You lied to me? Where did the bail money come from? We don't have any savings. Wyatt physically recoiled from her touch, looking like a trapped animal. He couldn't make eye contact with his wife. It came from Joshua, Nathan said bluntly, delivering the final, crushing blow. The $1,200 Joshua sent that month to save this house was used to keep Wyatt out of a county jail cell. Aunt Martha took Joshua's hard-earned money to cover up a crime. Absolute chaos erupted. Jessica stood up, kicking her chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. She started screaming at Wyatt. The key words of a destroyed marriage filled the air. She screamed about getting a lawyer. She screamed about filing for divorce immediately. And she screamed that he would never get custody of their 2 young daughters. Wyatt didn't even try to defend himself. He shoved past her, turned around, and practically ran out the front door. A moment later, we heard his truck engine roar to life and tires squeal as he peeled out of the driveway, fleeing the consequences of his actions. My mother collapsed heavily into her chair, sobbing hysterically into her hands. But this time, nobody rushed to comfort her. There were no pats on the back. The aunts and uncles who had praised her 20 minutes ago were now picking up their coats and purses in disgusted, horrified silence. Mr. and Mrs. Samuel slipped out the back door without saying a single word of goodbye. My father grabbed his worn denim jacket from the hook near the door. He didn't look back at his sobbing wife. He looked at me, his face pale but resolute. I am leaving with Robert tonight, he said. I am so sorry I was a coward, my boy. I will call you on Tuesday. Just you and me. He walked out. The heavy wooden door clicked shut firmly behind him. In a matter of 20 minutes, the empire of lies and manipulation my mother had built over decades was completely demolished. She was left sitting entirely alone at the head of a ruined table, sobbing under a cheap paper banner that read "Family First." David put his hand gently on my back. "Let's go home, Joshua," he said softly. I looked at my mother one last time. I felt no anger anymore, just a profound, hollow pity. I turned around, walked out the front door into the cool night air, and walked toward my car, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Behind me, the drive away from my parents' house was the quietest car ride of my entire life. David did not turn on the radio. I did not speak. The adrenaline that had been keeping my spine perfectly straight and my voice razor-sharp was slowly draining out of my system, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. We drove the short distance to Uncle Robert's house, where he had offered us his guest room for the night. When we finally pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, the sudden silence was deafening. I sat in the dark cabin of the car, gripping the steering wheel, my chest rising and falling with deep, shuddering breaths. David simply reached across the center console, placed his warm hand over mine, and squeezed. That single touch grounded me. The storm was over. I barely slept that night. I lay awake in the unfamiliar guest bed, watching the shadows of the tree branches move across the ceiling, replaying the look of sheer terror on my mother's face when the undeniable truth finally cornered her. I thought about Wyatt fleeing like a coward. Most of all, I thought about my father. I thought about the revelation that he had actually driven 4 hours to sit in the back row of my graduation, only to be dragged away by a malicious lie. The sun was barely breaking over the Georgia pine trees when I quietly slipped out of bed, leaving David asleep. I put on my jacket and walked out onto Uncle Robert's large wooden front porch. The morning air was sharp, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. I leaned against the wooden railing, watching the thick morning mist roll across the sprawling front lawn. I heard the crunch of gravel before I saw him. My father, Charles, was walking slowly down the long dirt driveway. He was holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee from the cheap local diner out on the highway. He was wearing the exact same flannel shirt he had worn the night before. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. He walked up the porch steps, hesitating slightly before holding out one of the cups to me. I took it. The heat of the coffee seeped into my cold hands. We stood side by side, leaning against the railing, looking out at the empty road. We stood in complete silence for a full 5 minutes. It wasn't the tense, suffocating silence of my childhood home. It was the silence of 2 men standing in the wreckage of a collapsed building, assessing the damage. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Joshua," my father finally said. His voice was incredibly rough, scraping against the quiet morning air. I didn't rush to comfort him. I took a sip of the bitter black coffee and waited. I needed him to say the words. "Robert told the truth," he continued, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the tree line across the road. "I was at your graduation. I saw you walk across that stage. You looked so tall. You looked so proud. And I left. I left because your mother called me screaming, swearing up and down that your brother was in the back of an ambulance. But that wasn't the real reason I left, Joshua." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with deep red. "I left because I was a coward," he said, his voice cracking on the final word. "I have been a coward for 30 years. I knew about the money you were sending. I didn't know the exact amounts, and I didn't know about the car loan, but Martha would make little comments. She would say you were helping out. She would say you were sending extra. I never once asked where it went. I knew the house was paid off. I knew it. But asking questions meant starting a war with your mother, and I traded your safety for my own peace and quiet." He offered no excuses. He didn't try to justify his actions by claiming he was manipulated. He simply sat with the full, devastating weight of his own failures. "You should have stayed, Dad," I said quietly. "I know," he whispered. "I know." I looked at the older man standing beside me. I saw the deep wrinkles around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the grease permanently stained into the creases of his knuckles. I realized then that holding on to my burning rage toward him was like drinking poison and expecting him to die. It would only destroy me. But forgiveness did not mean foolishness. I was never going to be the blind, compliant son again. "If you want to talk to me," I said, my voice steady and firm, "you can call me on Tuesdays. Just you. Not on speakerphone. Not with Mom in the room. If I hear her voice in the background, I will hang up. If you ask me for money, I will hang up. Tuesdays. Your voice, not hers. That is where we start. Do you understand?" My father looked at me, a profound mixture of grief and deep gratitude washing over his face. He nodded slowly. "Tuesdays. Just my voice. I understand, my boy." He reached over and gripped my shoulder, his rough fingers pressing firmly into my jacket. It was a quick, rough gesture, the way a man communicates when he completely distrusts himself to say anything more. We finished our coffee in silence. An hour later, David and I packed the car and drove back to Raleigh. I watched the Cooperton city limit sign fade away in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was driving forward instead of running away. The fallout over the next few months was absolute and spectacular. The truth is a relentless force once it escapes its cage, and in my family, it tore through the remaining lies like a hurricane. I learned the details gradually, mostly through brief, factual text messages from my cousin Nathan and my Uncle Robert. Wyatt's life completely unraveled. The revelation about the DUI and the secret bail money was just the tiny tip of a massive, rotting iceberg. Once Jessica realized that Wyatt and Martha had been actively lying to her about their finances, she started digging through their joint accounts and mail. She found a locked drawer in his home office. Inside, she found the credit card statements Wyatt had desperately been trying to hide. He wasn't just unemployed. He was drowning in severe online gambling debts. He had blown through their meager savings, maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards, and worse, he had secretly drained the small college fund that Jessica's parents had set up for their 2 young daughters. Jessica did not hesitate. She hired a ruthless lawyer and filed for divorce 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner party. She kicked Wyatt out of the house. Because of his documented DUI, his lack of employment, and his severe gambling addiction, the custody battle was incredibly short and entirely one-sided. Jessica was granted full primary custody of the girls. Wyatt was granted supervised visitation every other weekend, and he was ordered to pay child support with money he simply did not have. He ended up moving into a dingy, cheap motel on the outskirts of town, his golden boy image completely and permanently shattered. He had spent his entire life expecting a grand inheritance and endless bailouts, and now he had absolutely nothing. My mother's reaction to the collapse of her empire was exactly what you would expect from a cornered manipulator. She doubled down on the victim narrative. She deleted the photo of the Family First banner from her Facebook page and immediately began posting vague, passive-aggressive quotes about ungrateful children, the pain of a mother's broken heart, and how true Christians know how to forgive. But her audience was gone. The family had completely iced her out. Uncle Robert refused to take her calls. Aunt Mary publicly told her to stop showing her face at the church potlucks until she paid me back every single dime she stole. The social standing she prized above all else was completely gone. She tried to contact me, of course. 2 weeks after the dinner, my phone buzzed with a long, rambling text message from her. She didn't apologize for lying about the mortgage. She didn't apologize for ruining my credit. Instead, she wrapped her actions in a thick layer of justification. She wrote about the immense pressure she was under. She wrote about how she was just trying to keep the family together. She wrote, "I did what I thought was best, Joshua. You don't know what it is like to watch your child struggle." She was still calling Wyatt her child, completely ignoring the fact that she had cannibalized her other child to save him. I read the message while sitting comfortably on the plush leather sofa in my new penthouse. I didn't feel a spike in my heart rate. I didn't feel the old, familiar urge to justify my existence to her. I simply tapped the settings on my phone and put her contact on Do Not Disturb. I didn't block her entirely. I wanted a record of her harassment in case she ever tried to retaliate legally, but I ensured her notifications would never interrupt my peace again. I never replied. Boundaries do not require the other person's approval or understanding. They only require your strict enforcement. Meanwhile, my own life flourished in the absence of their chaos. The $1,200 a month that had been silently draining from my account for 6 years was suddenly staying right where it belonged. My salary felt massive. Without the burden of the fake mortgage, I aggressively paid down the remaining balance on the Chevy Equinox, completely closing out the loan. Within 4 months, my credit score bounced back entirely. My career accelerated. I poured the energy I used to spend worrying about my parents' fake financial crises into my work. 6 months after the dinner, I earned a massive promotion to senior data architect, coming with a significant salary bump and stock options. David and I celebrated by booking a 2-week vacation to Italy, paying for the flights and the luxury hotels in cash. The penthouse, which had once felt like a fragile dream constantly under threat by my mother's financial sabotage, finally felt solid, felt real. Every time I walked through the heavy oak front door, dropped my keys on the counter, and looked out at the glowing Raleigh skyline, I felt a deep, profound sense of safety. I had built this sanctuary brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, entirely on my own. Nobody else's name was on the deed. Nobody else had the power to take it away. It has been exactly 1 year since the dinner party that burned my family's toxic dynamic to the ground. Last Sunday afternoon, I was doing some deep cleaning in the penthouse. I was unpacking the very last cardboard box that had been sitting shoved in the back of my walk-in closet since moving day. It was a box filled with old college textbooks, tangled phone chargers, and random keepsakes I hadn't looked at in years. I reached the bottom of the box, my fingers brushing against a piece of thick, stiff paper. I pulled it out and held it up to the light pouring in from the bedroom window. It was the original cream-colored graduation invitation from North Carolina State University. The gold lettering across the front was still bright and immaculate. I slowly opened the card. Inside, written in my neat, 22-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Row 7, seats 4 and 5 are saved for you. I can't wait to see you." I stood in the quiet of my bedroom, holding the physical evidence of the most painful day of my youth. I expected the familiar ache in my chest. I expected the old resentment to rise up and choke me. But it didn't. I looked at the invitation, and I realized with absolute clarity that I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't angry. The sting of the rejection was completely gone. I was just entirely done carrying the weight of it. I walked out into the living room. David was sitting on the sofa, reading a financial journal, the afternoon sun warming his face. I walked over to the large oak bookshelf built into the wall. On the middle shelf, there was a framed photograph of David and me laughing on a boat in Venice. Next to it was a postcard from Uncle Robert congratulating me on my recent promotion. I placed the graduation invitation right there on the shelf, leaning it proudly against the wooden frame of the Venice photograph. I didn't put it there to remind myself of the agonizing pain. I put it there to remind myself of the incredible distance I had traveled. The journey to this penthouse, to this life of peace and security, had started in a desolate parking lot where I stood entirely alone with a diploma and absolutely nowhere to go. That empty chair in row 7 used to be the saddest thing I owned. Now, it was just the opening chapter of a massive success story. My father and I still talk every single Tuesday at 7 p.m. The calls started out incredibly awkward, mostly lasting 5 minutes where we discussed the weather or the subtle mechanics of a carburetor. But slowly, steadily, they are getting longer. Last week, we talked for 45 minutes. He told me he finally joined a local men's bowling league, going out on his own for the first time in decades. For a man who spent his entire adult life orbiting my mother's demands and schedule, joining a bowling league is nothing short of a massive personal revolution. He is not a perfect man. He spent 7 years watching me get robbed and said absolutely nothing. But he is actively trying to change, and trying counts as long as the effort is consistent. My mother still occasionally sends long, dramatic text messages, usually around major holidays. They are always completely wrapped in deflection, blaming the economy, blaming Wyatt's bad luck, blaming my lack of understanding. None of her messages ever start with the simple words, "I was wrong. I am no longer waiting for a perfect apology." I know she may never be capable of giving one, but the minimum entry fee to be part of my life is accountability. Until she can provide that, the heavy oak door to my life stays firmly locked. People ask me about the penthouse sometimes. They see the photos of the skyline, the expensive furniture, the balcony, and they mistakenly think that the money is the entire point of this story. They think this is a story about a guy who got rich and rubbed it in his family's face. It is not. I didn't buy this penthouse to prove anything to Wyatt. I didn't buy it to make my mother jealous. I bought it because after 7 years of working overnight shifts, living in tiny studio apartments, eating frozen vegetables, and sending agonizing automatic transfers to a house that didn't even need my money, I desperately wanted one thing that was entirely, undeniably mine. The word I posted under that Instagram photo, home, was never meant to be a financial flex. It was the very first time in my 29 years of existence that I had used that word and actually meant it. Home was not the yellow ranch house on Pannon Lane. Home was not where my blood relatives lived. Home was a place I had built myself, brick by brick, while the people who were supposed to protect me looked the other way. I used to firmly believe that personal strength meant enduring. I thought being a good man meant taking the hit, absorbing the unfairness, turning the other cheek, making room for other people's terrible choices, and calling it grace. I don't believe that anymore. Strength is not just about how much abuse you can carry on your back before your knees finally buckle. True strength is having the profound courage to stop stepping into the fighting ring altogether. It is the ability to look at the people who gave you life and say, "I love you, but I will not set myself on fire just to keep you warm. I am finally standing in the light. My name is Joshua, and for the first time in my life, nobody else gets to write my story. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Sharing this hasn't been easy, but I know I am not the only one who has walked this path. If there is one crucial lesson I want you to take away from my experience, it is this. Your worth is not defined by how much financial or emotional abuse you are willing to tolerate from the people who share your DNA. Toxic behavior does not suddenly become acceptable just because the person doing it is called mom or dad. Setting strict boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of absolute self-preservation. You are allowed to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. You are allowed to protect your peace, your hard-earned salary, and your mental health. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What is the most important lesson you took away from my story? Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with a family member? Please share your perspective in the